Welcome to the Science of Parenting podcast, where we connect you with research based information that fits your family. We'll talk about the realities of being a parent and how research can help guide our parenting decisions. I'm Mackenzie Johnson, parent of two littles with their own quirks, and I'm a parenting educator.
And I'm Suzanne Bartholomew. I'm an associate professor who strives to help people increase their financial security and the parent of a high schooler.
Yes, and we
Hello,
are.
Mackenzie.
I say we are here again. Hello, Suzanne. Having a lot of fun this season. Kind of getting towards the end of the season. I'm a little sad about it.
It's gone quickly.
Right? It has. It's gone quickly. But today we get to move into a different life stage, right? We talked about kind of our kids. Not kind of, We were talking about kids. And then we talked about teens. And now talking about emerging adults. So this in between this adultier adult, right? There's like all of these things that I feel like go into this stage, but I kind of just want to let's just dig right in. Like, what are we even talking about? And we have talked about this idea of emerging adults in previous seasons, right? It's come up a few times, but let's remind all your listeners, or if this is the first time you're hearing this term, welcome. I love this term. I'm fascinated by it. But so yeah, what do we know about emerging adults? One thing, actually, kind of the main researcher who I know you're going to talk about, Suzanne, Arnett, big heart for Arnett, love that. But he described this. I don't even remember in what paper. I read about it for grad school. I did a project in this area, and I just remember the phrase "freedom without full responsibility." It's usually this age range between 18-ish to mid 20s-ish. But freedom without full responsibility is how I remember him describing emerging adulthood. I'm like, yep, I related to that at the time. I was like, I'm an emerging adult.
Yeah. So emerging adulthood. What a description. So Arnett did extensive research in the early 2000s and came up with this distinct new developmental stage. And previously, researchers had been using milestones like marriage, finishing school, starting a career to describe adults. But then Arnett thought of, hey, let's just ask the young adults and see how they describe adult status. And it ends up that they're not using those markers as much as they are using more individualistic characteristics. So things like I'm taking responsibility for my actions. I can make my own decisions, independent decisions, and then also financial independence from parents. That's a big one. And a big piece of his research is what he discovered is that it is its own stage because young adults are very ambivalent about, they kind of have one foot in adolescence and one foot in adulthood. And they're kind of like, I'm a little bit of both, it's that financial, it's that freedom without the responsibility. And important to note that there's just a small minority of young adults in that age bracket that you described that are, they do consider themselves to be adults. And they use the same kind of descriptors that Arnett does, like being financially independent from their parents as an example, but they're just further along. It's a smaller minority, but if you become a parent at 18, you join the military at 18, hey, you consider yourself an adult.
Yes. And I think it's all really interesting. Like I said, I can get dorky about, well, a lot of things, but I do like this idea of emerging adulthood. Fascinated by this stage. And I think it's really interesting. I think part of it, my speculation, not like the research says necessarily, is how things change over time, right? And so this idea how that you were saying, they basically used to identify adulthood by these very clear markers, like you got married, you bought a house, you had a child, right? And then now it's this kind of more not as clearly measurable or as clearly defined. I feel like part of that is almost changing of the time. But part of it is hopefully just kind of this acceptance of it's just different. It just looks different.
Yeah, right. We change. Families look different from generation to generation, depending on the environment and what's thrown at them. And I think certainly young adults today have had a lot more financial challenges than those in the past.
It is. It can be a different reality. And we don't need to say whether better, worse, right?
No
we don't need to add value to it. Yeah, measurement as much as just let's talk about how it is, like how it can be different, how it is different. And I think, as we were talking about emerging adulthood, and all the fascinating things about it, even just thinking about all the different ways that an emerging adult can quote unquote like look. Right. And so, I mean, we did kind of come up with a list of like, okay, someone might be going into the workforce. Someone might be in trade school. Someone might be working full time in a career but live at home. Someone might be a tradition like might be a college student. Someone might be taking a gap year. Someone might have kids but like be financially dependent on their parents, right? There's like all these different ways emerging adulthood can quote unquote look for somebody. And I think that's part of the thing that fascinates me about it is like like it's muddy. It's ambiguous. It's I don't know, just this in between of like half in, half out, like you said.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the family, right? There's so many configurations of the family system, and young adults are part of that family system, and they make it either they put their own stamp on it, whatever that might look like.
Yes.
Like mom and dad are paying for my cell phone bill, but I'm paying for my own rent. I'm
Yes.
helping with tuition, but so are my parents. They're helping with tuition.
Mhm. Absolutely,
Yeah.
and yeah, and you're right, you're getting into this, like, of course, what we're gonna dig like, what we want to in the episode of this financial component of it, right? So emerging adulthood is fairly new in the research of, like, a developmental stage of a family and somebody's, like, development as just a human person, but there's these financial things that go into it, right? And so whether someone is a college student or like we said, like all of those examples in trade school, going into the workforce, military, there's all these financial things that come with this half in, half out, right? This like freedom of choice, but not full responsibility of choice financially. And so, I mean, we were like, as just even talking about it, it's like, okay, it could be this, it could be this. So we talked about student loans, like a huge financial decision that happened in this emerging adulthood stage. Might be the first time like leasing or renting or paying room and board, credit cards, all kinds of credit cards, and maybe no longer filtered out by their parents. There
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
vehicles. There might be maybe they've had jobs, maybe the first time they're actually managing that income from that job, right? Um, Wedding planning often happens in this stage. And I think yeah, there's a lot of financial stuff that happens here. And you pointed out with long term impact, right? Like the potential impact of these decisions can be long term, like can set the stage really for adulthood.
Yeah, yeah. So the financial decisions have much bigger consequences, and we've talked about this in the previous episodes. That we're
Mhm.
trying to through parenting, financial parenting, and socialization, trying to set them up for success, so that when
Yes.
they get to these more consequential decisions, that they're ready for them. But certainly, I mean, just the credit card example. That if a young adult gets a credit card, they don't pay their bills on time. Then all of a sudden, their credit rating declines, and then all of a sudden
Mhm.
opportunities, we know that employers and landlords will check credit reports, and they could get boxed out of opportunities as a result. And
Yes.
so yeah, it's such a critical time that they're either going to be on this path to security or instability, and so as parents we all want them to be on that path of security.
Yes. Well, and I think also this idea of the like financial independence in emerging adulthood, right? That like we talk about the freedom but not the responsibility. And so that idea of are they financially independent? Like, aren't they that? And there's layers of that. Like you said, like maybe they pay just their cell phone. Maybe they pay their room and board. Maybe they still give a weekly allowance. Like, there's all these variations. But that idea of financial independence, what can you tell us about financial independence in emerging adulthood? I guess.
Okay, so as researchers, the way we measure is, are they taking full control of their financial life? So are they earning their own
Okay.
income, making their own living? Are they paying
Hmm.
for their rent, their housing, like whether it's a mortgage or rent? Are they paying their bills? And then
Hmm.
are they managing their money? So
Yes.
that's kind of financial independence, is just taking full control
Hmm.
without any help.
Yeah. And so in emerging adulthood, I would say for a lot of emerging adults that by that full definition, I still say us. I'm really not an emerging adult anymore, but I still really identify with this. Um but I feel like a lot of
uh,
emerging adults really necessarily by that definition might not fully meet it. but those layers come in, right? Like, well, I pay for this, like I pay my own rent and I buy my own groceries and my parents help me with this.
Mhm.
Or right? I feel like there's a lot of
Yeah.
layers in there for emerging adults.
Yeah, and it's not real clear cut, for
Yeah.
parents, in terms of, like, what's the norm. Every family is gonna
Mm.
have a different set of expectations and norms of what kids should or should not, like, what kids should be paying for, what they should be paying for,
Mhm.
and just like when we're parenting a toddler or for a 5-year-old and we're thinking about, like, developmentally, where should they be? Are they on time? This is a lot less
Yeah.
clear in terms of what is financial independence and are we doing the right thing and
Mm.
are we helping them or are we hurting them? Um,
Yeah.
so
And it
yeah,
is,
it
it's
can be
a muddy,
confusing.
it is, yeah, a confusing, muddy, ambiguous. Like, hey, your children are now over the age of 18. And for a lot of people are like, we made it. And then it's like, but hey, it's really confusing here, okay?
Yeah, it is like, what is normal, air quotes, right?
Yes. And I
And
think that it's nice to kind of understand, like we always say, like gather the information so we can make our own decisions around this. And you actually talked about some really interesting research around this. There's this idea of trajectories that you were talking
yeah,
about. Tell us about
for
those.
for financial independence, yeah, and there hasn't been a
Yeah.
lot of research on this, but this was a study that it was longitudinal study, really strong modeling that
Yeah.
categorized young adults into 4 groups in terms of their financial independence, and the first one was, being consistently independent, and that was about
Okay.
20% of the young adults in their sample, and basically at 18, they left the house and pretty much cut ties
Okay.
with their parents,
Yeah.
um, and then there's quickly independent, and so this group kind of starts out independent, and then they quickly uh, and then the support from parents quickly declines. Okay, so
Okay.
they're quickly independent. So they and then gradually independent, they more steadily step towards independence. All
Okay.
right. So they start out with support, but then as they age, they kind of age out in terms of independence and then
Mhm.
consistently supported. And that's like they never cut ties with their parents.
Okay.
And that's
Cut
about
ties being
13%.
financially.
Yeah, financially.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So, yep. So the largest group is that quickly independent where they start out dependent
Mm.
on their family and then they quickly become more let they receive less support from their parents.
Yeah. Okay, my brain is picturing like topography, like a hill versus like a mountain versus a cliff versus a like flatland almost of like
Yeah.
cuz the first one was consistently independent, right? So like
Mhm.
they
Mhm.
have been riding on this like plane, right? Like pretty like always, right? Like they are in the flat
Fairly
lands of
independent.
Iowa on consistently independent, right? So that was trajectory number 1. Trajectory number 2 was quickly, right? Was quickly independent. So
Mhm.
yeah, that might be like our city sat on a hill for a long period of time and then like quick little like there's a big hill at the end where we went to quick financial independence, right?
I love your
I'm thinking
imagery use.
sledding.
Yes. Yeah.
Like
Oh,
we're
I like it.
sledding.
Yeah. So still have financial ties with parents, but then they're quickly becoming independent. Yeah. And that's
Yes.
the largest group right there.
Okay, and that's the biggest group, that's sledding. Okay.
Mhm.
And then so I'm like word picture for number 3. Then this one was gradually,
Mhm.
right? Okay, so this might be
Yeah.
like a long slow like decline over time. Like this is getting intricate, but I'm like sea level, like slowly to sea level. But
Yeah, a
like,
little
yeah, a
bit
long
longer
slow.
duration. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe there's hills in there, right? We're like at certain points it's like, well, we're connected. I worked on this, but then I moved back home, right? Or
Right.
I was like, I'm doing this part, but I could use assistance with this part right now. But that connection stays longer until the independence at the end. And then our fourth category, remind me.
Yeah, and this is the longest duration and pretty
Mhm.
much that's the consistently supported group.
Okay.
And I hope I said that
Yeah.
earlier, but yeah, so they
Mhm.
pretty much have support with housing and bills and, whatever their bills are
Mhm.
from their parents.
Okay, so that's like living in the mountains in my mind. Like if I'm going on this elevation imagery that I have. But it is right? Like never
Like a
never
rope?
really
Are you
going
are
sledding
mountain
down that
climbing?
hill into independence.
Mhm.
And so but that idea of consistently, and so that is, so our largest group are our sledders. No, right? Or quickly.
Yep, yep.
Okay.
I think that's how you described it, yeah.
Okay, I'm like, gotta keep track of my own picture here. Yeah. What else can you tell us about these groups then? Because yeah, like that's the largest group, but there's outcomes associated with this, right? Like some
Yeah,
of the
yeah, yeah,
positive
and
benefits,
that
or like what do they see happens?
well, and that's what I love about this research is that they have linked, they've linked the groups to financial well-being outcomes,
Hmm.
and it's that and the quick consistently independent group. So that group that
Hmm.
is at a younger age becoming independent from their parents
Yeah, like the
financially.
cliff.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like their subjective and objective measures of
Mm-hmm.
financial well-being, they tend to be lower. They tend to be the
Okay,
lowest.
like
Yeah.
lowest financial well-being.
Yeah. Yep,
Okay,
yep, yep.
which I
So in
guess
other words,
makes
because
sense.
yeah,
In terms
yeah.
of, if we think about what we've talked about in previous episodes around the like support offered and how soon you have financial experiences, right? That like some of these things, if we go from like now I'm an adult and I'm like cutting those financial ties, those opportunities to learn with a safety net of your parents, right? We
Mhm.
lose some of that, which does have an impact on our financial well-being.
Yeah, yeah.
So that makes
And
sense.
the modeling looks at different factors that would predict why people are in these groups and are in these
Mm,
trajectories. And so typically lower socioeconomic status
okay.
individuals are in that quickly independent or consistently independent group. So the ones that are
Hmm.
launching a lot sooner at like 18 years old
Yes.
versus like the gradually independent group. Well, the two middle groups, the quickly
Hmm.
independent and the gradually independent, are more likely to be going to pursue a degree in school,
Okay.
and maybe their parents are also maybe have higher levels of education than that other group.
Yeah. Mhm.
So, which
So
it
even
does
the
make sense.
opportunity, yeah, the opportunity of what like their families are able to provide looks different, which impacts the rate at what like their trajectory. That makes sense.
Right, right, right. And
Mhm.
that gradually independent group, what they're pursuing education, but they're not maybe getting as much support from parents like for
Mm.
tuition. And so they end up with
Mhm.
the study found that they ended up with more student loan debt. So that
Oh,
also
yeah.
sets your trajectory in terms of financial well-being if you're leaving school with a lot of loans versus someone who
Yes.
doesn't.
Mhm.
So, but it's early
Yes, also
research and
gets
there
an
has yeah.
education. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think
Mm.
it's fascinating research. There hasn't been a lot done on it.
Mhm.
And so yeah,
Yeah,
I
a preliminary look at this idea, but a cool look at it nonetheless, like a cool
mhm.
way of looking at this idea. And so using that information, for ourselves as parents, the idea of like, okay, we understand that emerging adulthood is this kind of half in, half out, right? Like freedom without full responsibility. We can understand that like it's not just you. This stage is like defined by that. Not everyone's going to experience it the same way, but that confusion and muddiness is like a part of it, which means that as parents, because our child, our emerging adult child is in this gray area, like that means we're kind of in there, right? We're in there in our parenting in this gray area of like, well, they're kind of doing their own thing, but kind of still not. Right. And so
Yeah.
I think it's important for us to acknowledge that as we think about financial parenting for our 20-year-old, for our 26-year-old, for our 18-year-old, whatever age, that it can come with this gray area. And that can mean I almost want to say discomfort for us, right? Like this unknown of like, should I or shouldn't I is really a big
Mm,
question that we have as parents in this stage. And should I do this? Should they do this? Should I kick them off the cell phone plan? Should I make them go get blank? And we ask a lot of these questions, and so many things influence it. Like how we answer those questions, right? Like our income and financial stability, the way that we were raised, right? Like what our parents did with us. And I think that's something else that's really interesting. You mentioned earlier that this has changed, like the stage of emerging adulthood has changed over time because of society, right? Like adults now are having a different experience than emerging adults 20 years ago. Um, and I think that for when we're parenting an emerging adult now, if we had a different experience, I think it can leave us with this feeling of like feeling really torn about it, right? The like ambiguity of I don't know if I should or shouldn't. But I also think there's just like this value sometimes, this pull of like, am I supposed to be sending them off to go do it themselves or am I supposed to be supporting them? And I
Yeah.
kind of just want to like hold a little space for that for a minute of like, it can feel weird. And it's like, and that's not your fault. um,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know.
It's a natural, I think, conflict because we
Hmm.
we are parenting for independence,
Yeah.
but we have to keep our eye on the prize that we're also parenting for the best for our children in terms of
Hmm.
financial security and well-being in particular. That's the topic. That
Yes.
and so that to accept the fact, and parents have over time have accepted the fact that economic independence or financial independence is coming slower for this
Mm.
generation because of a lot of structural issues, things like low
Hmm.
wage, more expensive housing, um, lower housing stock of affordable um, of
Yes.
affordable homes, and also that there's a greater financial investment that's required
Mm.
to become a mature adult in terms of finances. So, like, compared to a
Yes.
generation ago, which we had talked about, that a high school
Hmm.
education would get you a job that would have a living wage that you could afford to support a family and maybe buy a house, right?
Hmm.
And today it's not the same.
Hmm.
Maybe two jobs are required, and maybe you're not buying a house until much later in life. So there's a lot more structural things going on. We had the Great Recession. We've had the pandemic. So every generation's had its own challenge. Every cohort has
Hmm.
its own challenge. But yeah, so back to that natural conflict between wanting to make our child independent versus wanting to have the best for them. So I
Yeah.
would just, recommend to parents that your goal is not just independence, it's also well-being. And that
Mm.
it's okay to keep financial ties if that's, and you might be conflicted, but in
Yes.
the long run, by being supportive, they're going to be better off. And
Mhm.
that's okay.
And that's okay. I'll say and that's the thing is I don't even think it's, like, this is what we should do as much as, like, hold that space for yourself as a parent of, like, this is unfamiliar territory for me. Like, I've never even if I have a child who's older than this child, I've never been through this with this child. Or I've never made these
Yeah.
decisions with this distinct set of circumstances. Even if I made a quote unquote similar decision 3 years ago or 2 years ago or 10 years ago. Um, and so I do think it's important for us to think about as we think about like how do I coach and parent my emerging adult financially, like holding that space for okay, I might feel a little torn. I might feel like this is different than what I had, but it's also okay to just hold that of like my experience was this, that may not be my child's experience. And that can bring up difficult feelings. Like hold space for that too. I don't know, and I just feel like there's a lot of values here and there's a lot of each of us for our own reality. And I guess that's kind of where I'm going back to is like this idea of a pluralistic approach. Like there's not one way only to financially like to teach your emerging adult about financial independence and financial well-being and to help them get there. Like there's more than one way and we can hold that space and that there's going to be some muddiness here and that each of us is going to make the best decision we know how. Like each of us is going to
Yeah.
take this information, make the best decision we know how for our own family. Um, even the like, should my child come back and live with me decision, right? There's this whole like quote unquote movement of boomerang kids, right? They go to college and then move back in, or they move out and then have some kind of financial hardship and move back in. And I think it's not necessarily always just as clear cut as should I let them? Maybe I physically don't have the space and so it would be like detrimental to both of us. Or maybe I can't afford it. Or maybe I can, but our relationship is strained. Or maybe I can and I've got plenty of space and I'm lonely. Like there's so many situations and that like context within we make that decision. Um, and so just acknowledging like, hey, it's all right, it feels weird, but you get to choose. and make that decision, like informed decision, regardless of the judgment or the shoulds for your own family and your own situation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's really well stated, that there is such
Thanks.
a plurality, and the one point we're missing also is that
Hmm.
I just, for those parents that are listening who don't have coachable children, that
Yeah.
I don't think we've acknowledged, the child that maybe jumps right into independence, makes decisions to maybe be an early aged parent,
Yes.
get married early. That looks very different in terms of, maybe what we've been talking about. Let's say it
And
that
it's
way.
not, yeah, well, and it's
And
not
then
all within like our parent, what we do as a parent is within our like reach of control, but like ultimately we do not control our emerging adult. Like they are an adult. Even if they're
yeah,
not
yeah.
like a full, right? They're kind of a need an adultier adult sometimes, but that, yeah, you're right. Like some kids are just like, hey, I've already decided I'm not asking for your input.
I went out and I
And
bought a
that
car.
happens.
Hi, this
Hmm.
is my new car. And like, what?
Right. And
You did
ultimately
what?
that's not your decision, which like your realm of influence can be different for your child than I have for mine, or then, right? It looks different because every kid is a part of the mix,
Right, right,
not just
exactly.
one way.
Yeah, right. And so that
Mm,
that was kind of the point I wanted to make, that is definitely bi-directional nature of influence
yes.
between parents and kids and parents, And so
Hmm.
um kids moving back into the household, you mentioned, maybe there's not enough room, and there's definitely evidence that having kids in the household can be a strain, can be a financial
Yes.
strain, and
Yes.
so there are so many factors that go into it.
Well, and I think I even know a family that there was a gap, right? So they're like a blended family, and so they have a I mean, I use the term tag along, a child with a large age gap from older siblings. And so there was like a child in school in their home and an adult sibling. Like they literally were like, you can't move in because like this isn't working because we have a young child, right? And so there's just like so many, yeah, so many different
Yeah,
situations. But so
yeah,
the good
but
news, oh, go ahead.
as I say, but one thing I will say is that over time, parents have embrace the idea that there are gonna be financial ties over,
Yes.
longer than the age 18, and
Mm-hmm.
so, and that's regardless of income, that
Mm,
parents are they're increasingly willing to help their adults, young adults, children,
yes.
young adult children, and, and so I think the data is like 22% of all, regardless of age, 22%
Mm,
of adults receive financial support from their parents. So
yes.
that's a fifth, so and it
Yes.
goes both ways too, right?
Mhm. And I
In
think that's
terms, yeah.
important to understand of like our culture, right? Like over generations, over time, there is this shift in one, like we saw a new developmental stage literally called emerging adults, but the shift of this acceptance of that, right?
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
understanding that like it's not just you. Right? There are other people and other families experiencing this. I do think one of the great things that I mean, always, I'm referring back to that CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It's like, okay, we're like, there's a million ways to do this, not just one way. But there is also like strategies and information. So, one of the things that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau talks about with emerging adults is they say when our kids are younger, financially, we provide a lot more direction and instruction. As
Mhm.
they get older, particularly in emerging adulthood, our role shifts to reflection and feedback on their financial decisions. So I
Mm.
loved that. More reflection and feedback. So as they are looking at maybe leasing a car or car loan or whether or not to fix a car or right whatever those financial decisions are, our role in emerging adulthood becomes reflection and feedback. I can even share, I've shared before, I have a younger sister who's in this emerging adulthood stage, and they kind of hit a financial, her and her fiance hit a financial hiccup recently. And I did kind of, I'm not her parent, but I did feel a little bit of that role of it wasn't my job to say you shouldn't do that or you can't do that, right? But to be more supportive of okay, what happened with this financial hiccup? Like, what happened here? How could we prevent it from happening again? What are we learning? How do we, like, but that processing part felt more appropriate than like, that wasn't a good idea. Right? That wouldn't have been very helpful, probably.
Yeah. Well, that's good feedback for your sister, right? I mean,
Totally.
for to have that reflection on, and for any young adult. But yeah, I think that
Mm.
because financial independence and the because it's become a longer period, a more prolonged period,
Mhm.
we as parents can be we can have a more influential role for a longer period of
Yes.
time. And so we can offer that reflection and feedback on decisions. And this podcast season we've been talking about financial well-being and those building
Mhm.
blocks. And so financial knowledge, decision making, those personal traits like executive function, and then habits and norms, that's what we're trying to build with them, and where we can, kind of point them in the right direction for, okay, you're thinking about buying a car. Have you looked into how much you can afford? What's going to be your payment per month? Do
Mhm.
you know, are you going to pay cash for it? Are you going to try and buy a car? So really, giving them feedback about a decision they're trying to make. And
Yeah.
they should hopefully, if they're open to it,
Yep.
hopefully they'll put those critical skills to use, which again are like the ability to find information, use it, and then act on it, which is
Mm.
where we're trying to socialize them to.
Yes. Well, and I mean, you're always just wrapping it back in. That's exactly what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And those are the places, I mean, there's lots of places, but those are the places where that reflection and feedback, we do have a role when our children are open to it. Our adult children, right?
Mhm.
That sometimes feels silly to say. When our
Yeah.
adult children are open to that feedback, that is a role we can have. There was also this really great, some of these really great strategies, which we're going to dig into here, which some of you might remember from previous seasons, based on self determination theory, which I'm a geek for. But around self determination theory and becoming financially independent or self sufficient. So they talked about it as in parenting financially, autonomy supportive, which is like how do we support their independence, competence, right? Like their actual skills. What do they know how to do that they feel confident in? How do we support their competence? And how do we support them with relatedness or connection? So those were the
Yeah.
3 categories of strategies, and I wanted to dig into these. So if we can, let's go with autonomy. So some of the examples they gave were providing choices in how to make financial decisions for your emerging adult. Like, well, you could, right? We're talking about cars. You could lease, you could get a car loan, you could save up until you can pay cash. You could, right? Like out helping them outline the options that would support their independence. Right? You're not telling them you need to do this as much as like, okay, I'm gonna help you find the choices within your options. And then another one for encouraging that autonomy, supportive things is encouraging independent money management. So encouraging them to practice those skills of paying bills, of knowing their interest rates, of knowing when things are due, of like having the knowledge they need. And so those are things that we can do to support their financial independence from the aspect of like autonomy or independence.
Yeah. I love perfect description of it. And as parents, it's kind of hard to not express our opinions sometimes.
Yeah.
And right, especially if we see our child going down the road where like, oh, that's not going to be a good ending. And
Mhm.
so yeah, but autonomy is so important, but to be able to do it in a supportive way, I think,
Mhm.
will make them feeling supported versus feeling thwarted, because thwarted is the
Ooh,
other, like,
yeah.
end of the perspective of like, okay, you know what, I feel like my parents are supporting my decision and I can express myself as who I am, versus
Mhm.
no, they're just subjecting me to their opinion, and now I feel like I can't be who I want to be.
Yes, yes. Well, and so this other part I feel like really taps into a lot of your knowledge and I mean, all of them fall within your knowledge and expertise, but this competence, right? What they actually, the skills they have. So the examples they give for being a competent supportive parent for financial self-sufficiency, encouragement of setting and achieving financial goals, right? Helping them
Hmm.
say like, "Oh, you'd really like to purchase this thing, like let's set a goal for that. How do you want to do that? How much are you planning to save or work towards that? Are you planning to work extra hours to get it?" Helping them set and achieve those goals, giving them positive feedback on their financial behaviors. And I thought that's like a man, positive feedback. We've been talking about that at every age, not just financially, right? These are just general parenting skills of, hey, look at that. You've been saving for this for a long time and you did it. Like, you've got it now. Or you, like, holy cow, you went through a lot of research or exploring to figure out what the best option is. And look at the good deal you got. right? And so giving them that positive reinforcement. And then the third example they give is just that belief, like genuine belief in your child's financial capability. Encouraging them of like, hey, you know what? Yeah, maybe you haven't bought a car before, but you have made financial decisions before. I know you can make good decisions. Like, let's talk about how you make that decision. And I think that belief, yeah, it's literally about supporting their competence. Like, you can do things, you can do hard things, which is good for an
Right.
emerging adult who maybe isn't feeling so sure.
Yeah, and when we look at, like, personal traits in the whole, how do we build
Mm.
financial well-being, that self-efficacy, the financial self-efficacy is really what
Hmm.
this taps into when it comes to competence. So, you really wanna build up your young adults' feeling of competency, so you
Mm.
wanna encourage them to either improve their skills or follow through on skills they already have, like, to strengthen them,
Yes.
and not point out like, oh, well, if you buy that car, you're probably going to get it repossessed. I mean, like that you're going to
Hmm.
fail at what this is. That's going to completely undermine the way they feel. And that's not
Yes.
our job as parents. We, want to help
Hmm.
help them feel like, oh yes, I'm competent. I can achieve this goal,
Hmm.
versus like, oh, I don't know if I can do it.
Yes.
That's,
And there
yeah.
is a difference between helping them understand a potential consequence and like labeling that as like what is going right, like assigning it to them of like, okay, well, let's understand what will happen if we don't, right, if we can't afford it, is very different than like if you buy that car it's going to get repossessed, right? Those
Yeah.
are very different like approaches that both give your child information about what could happen, but one is supportive and one is thwarting, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. And then there is this one more that talks about this connectedness. How do we support
Hmm.
their connectedness? And so it talks about having a genuine interest in their financial situation, that it's something we talk with them about, even, right? That we let them know, like, I care about how you're doing with your finances. Um, Encouraging their ability to cope with financial difficulties. That might be financially, but they also talk about even just being empathetic in times of financial strain. So there may be financial support in that connectedness, but it could also just be like, you know what, this is hard. Like, this sucks that this unexpected cost came up and you're not ready for it. Like, this is hard. And just whether or not that's something we help them resolve financially, but even just showing up for our kids, that connectedness piece, that warmth, right? Like we talk about in general parenting, that's there.
Yeah, I mean, you said it, whether it's finances or any domain, it's the quality of our parenting, the quality of our relationship with our child and how
Hmm.
connected we are, how supportive we are. You said warmth, affection,
Hmm.
just making them feel like, the people that I care about me.
Hmm.
Versus like the people I care about they're really acting like they don't like me very much
Mm.
because they're
Yeah.
because they're not interested in I brought up the issue of maybe wanting to live on my own, and then it just got kind of brushed away, or
Hmm.
I got poo-pooed by the idea of wanting to pursue something. And
Hmm.
that's that's an icky feeling for anybody.
That is. And so, yeah, we love these. I loved these strategies. One, we know I love self determination theory, but this idea of thinking about, we're like, okay, there's a million ways through parenting and emerging adulthood financially, lots of different approaches. And there are some strategies that like can be helpful and that can help build your parent child relationship. Because, yes, even though they're an emerging adult, you still have one. They're still your child, you're still their parent. And yeah, that we can
Yeah.
understand our role in this realm in whatever situation our child is as an emergent adult, that our role can be reflection and feedback here.
Right.
And I think that's a
Yeah, and
great.
it's a balance between all of them, right? I mean, you want them
It's
to
all
have
the things.
yeah, I mean, you want them to have autonomy, you want them to be competent, and you want to be and you want to have a connection with them. So, there's a lot
Hmm.
that's going into it, as we say about most things, but,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, and as you said, also, I mean, you said it earlier, but I want to highlight it because I'm like, I almost feel like I zoomed past it when you said it. But yeah, balancing also, like you said, the independence with the security, because sometimes like those don't always go hand in hand, right? If we shove our child into financial independence, right? Like you talked about with the trajectories, that might affect how secure they are. Versus if we can kind of gradually support them, that might help them end up more secure in the long term. And so we are, based on our own situation, like that's another huge balance we're having there.
Yeah, it is, and if you have more than
Mhm.
one child, it's, gonna look different for each of your children, and we talked a little
Mhm.
bit about that,
Mhm.
I have a sister who was always very independent, left the home early, got married early, had children early, but her financial stability was much more precarious because of those decisions, right? And my parents' tie to her financially also ended up being stronger because she needed help.
Yes. And it can look so different and yeah, whether or not as the parent that was their decision about the independence versus stability, that's not always within the parent's control because this is an adult child.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of things that we've got rolling through here. There's a lot of space for grace in emerging adulthood. There's a lot of muddiness and unclear about shouldn't, but that there are opportunities that we can continue to help them in their financial capability, and all the other good words, right? I'm like, financial capability, we've learned financial socialization, financial well-being, financial independence. We've learned a lot of good words. I like a lot of finance words this season.
Yeah. But and the point, I guess the most important point is, as parents, to keep your eye on the prize, that you want your child to be independent, but you want them also to be financially secure. And if that means, it's okay if that means you're going to continue to support them into adulthood. And as we know, 22% of adults are still getting help from their parents. So in one way or the other. So it doesn't stop. That's the one thing we don't really, parenting never stops.
Goes on. Just keeps going on, doesn't it?
It really does. It really does.
Yes. So you get to decide how you're parenting financially in emerging adulthood. So this brings us to our stop, breathe, talk space with our producer, Mackenzie Young. I know she has a question because she talked about it earlier. So I'm not sure what she's cooked up here.
So my question actually is more of a request for a conversation. which is directly tied to what you were just talking about. So, and Mackenzie, at the beginning you said, well, I'm not sure. I feel like I'm an emerging adult, but so for those of us that are maybe in the sandwich generation, so we're the ones with, we have parents that are supportive of us, or we have parents, right? Period. And then we have kids, or we have nieces and nephews, in my case, just navigating the financial realm. I mean, the world that we're in right now anyway is just kind of crazy. But navigating being in that sandwich generation as an emerging adult. So how do we, as the emerging adult who also maybe I have kids, or I feel like, oh, I'm at this point where I am kind of financially independent, but how can we, what advice would you give to those people, which I'm assuming we have lots of listeners that are in that world, right? What advice can we give them in terms of navigating being in that sandwich generation as an emerging adult? That was hard to say, apparently.
Can I have a clarifying?
Yes.
I want to make sure the way I'm thinking about it is the group we're talking about is I maybe have financial dependence like children while I may be somewhat financially dependent on my parents. Is that fair?
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, in this ambiguous, muddy stage of dependence and independence, half in, half out, as we've said. That's a tricky one. Anything come straight to mind for you, Suzanne?
Sorry.
That is a tricky question. I think as an emerging adult, I hate to use the word responsibility, but realizing that your decisions have consequences, and that you do need to take responsibility in terms of understanding how they impact your children and how they impact your parents. That generationally we are all connected. So the economic stress of grandparents can seep to parents, that can seep to the emerging young adult, to even the grandchildren. I don't know, that's a tough one.
No, that's an important. I agree, Suzanne. Yeah, acknowledging the like radiation, not the radiation, but like the ripple out of the impact that financial situation, our financial situation has to our family members there. And
Certainly, yeah.
oh, go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, I was thinking, like Mackenzie D,
Mhm.
which I like to, thinking about your, like, let's say you as an emerging, I know you're older than an emerging adult, but your parents' age, they're probably thinking about retirement, but they also want to be supportive of their children and their grandchildren. But then,
Mhm.
do you put your own needs above, like your
Mm,
children's needs above your needs? And so I just feel like there's some responsibility of someone that is accepting assistance from their parents, even if they're a parent, like that sandwich person, that they
mhm.
need to understand the ramifications. I guess I'm just repeating what I said,
Yeah.
but
No, but
No, but in a different way. Like that adds understanding to it.
so I
yeah.
guess one side of the question that I maybe didn't clarify was like, how can we? It's kind of like the picture of like the two kids with the house and the fence, and
Mhm.
we're in that sandwich generation. I feel like I'm have my parents' support, but I'm also feeling the pressure of what is around me and maybe what I'm seeing around me and what society maybe says is where I'm supposed to be at.
Mm,
Um, like
Mhm.
I that is maybe part of it where I was kind of looking at too,
Oh.
like the people around us, like what's
mm,
expected if we're supposed to have the house, but in our financial times that it's really hard to buy a house and
yes. Because
maybe
okay, the two words that came to mind, luckily they stuck around when you gave further explanation.
Mhm,
That they still apply, I think, of like I think one, grace, and two, clarity.
sure.
Um, so I think grace and like giving yourself permission to be where you're at, right? And like to be wherever your parents are, to be where, right? So like as like you said, retirement. Okay, my parents, even though my friends' parents could support them in this purchase, my parent can't. Or
Mhm,
even though blank blank, right? So like the grace for ourselves, for our parents, and then yes, if we do have like dependents, right? If we have children, then that like the grace for our kids of like what's the experience that they're having. And so I think grace is a part of this.
mhm,
Also not passing the judgment along to future generations and to people around us of like,
mhm.
well, I have this, so you should have this.
True.
Um and then yeah, I think also like clarity around expectations around what
Mm.
is and is not appropriate, the communication piece of that of yes, if your parents are in a like limited income situation, like whether that's retirement or whatever, of like okay, once this happens, we will not be able to support you in this way. Or
Mhm.
there will come a time when X, but like having that communication and clarity around that, I think
Yeah.
is important. And then the other thing I want to that I don't feel like we tapped into this in this episode is there is like even though the ending phase of emerging adulthood is not particularly like distinctive, like now
Mhm,
you're not an emerging adult,
mhm.
you do move out of emerging adulthood, right? So like when particularly up for debate, Suzanne, you can disagree with me. I would say financial independence in particular is like a main marker of moving out of that emerging adulthood. And so once
Mhm.
you right no longer depend financially on your parents in those capacities, we do eventually move out of emerging adulthood. So I would say like it's not like all parents, like if you have children, you're an emerging adult, like just because you're quote unquote young, you're not
Mhm.
necessarily an emerging adult. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I feel like we brought up more questions than answers, and I apologize for that. Which is funny, that was one of the questions Barb kinda sent through, and then I've been
Mm,
sitting thinking about it the whole time you've been recording. I'm like, "Okay, well,
Mhm.
like, what about those people in the middle?"
and there is like you can be both an emerging adult and a parent. Like we're talking about parenting emerging adults, but you can be both too.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, thanks, and
Awesome.
I'm sorry.
You're like, question you
Good.
responded, was it answered? But I'll say an important conversation, right? Like, if nothing else, we're bringing our attention to the like diverse, right? The different experiences that each of us can have as
Mhm.
parents, like, yeah, and who we're parenting and all those things
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. All
And
right.
also, I guess as a conclusion to that is that communication is the best thing for all relationships, and being very clear, like you said, clarity, but also just being clear about expectations and gratitude, and for support when you do get support, and acknowledgement maybe to yourself and others.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good words to wrap it on.
I'll leave so I don't bring any more stress here.
Yeah. No more hard questions. You have to go. Oh, thanks, Kenz. You're not so bad. We give you a bad rap. But thanks for listening in today. I feel like we really just kind of, obviously talking about emerging adults, but we talked around like an ambiguous stage in a lot of ways, because there is a lot of ambiguity. But yeah, who are emerging adults? What are the financial things, right? A lot of stuff is happening financially in this stage, and how do we understand and support our kids in this stage with those financial decisions that they're making? And so hopefully you got some strategies, understanding what our role is here, and that we know there's a lot of different ways, right? There's not just like, this is the way you must parent financially. It's not you should or you shouldn't. That's not always the answer. The answer is taking in the information to make a decision so that you can balance, like you said, that financial independence for them, and that financial security in the long term, and making that decision within your own reality.
Yeah. So great summary of the episode.
Thanks.
So our next episode, we're going to wrap up the season on kids and money, and we're going to be talking about raising good consumers.
And I like this idea of consumerism. I'm excited to talk about it, though I am a little sad it'll be the last episode of the season.
Oh, yeah, I know. It's like we could have 8 more episodes on this topic, but
yes,
smart consumers
I think that means
is a great one to end on.
Right? And I'm like, I think that means we could just keep talking and keep hanging out. But so join us next week. But thanks for joining us today on the Science of Parenting podcast. Don't forget that you can email our team specific parenting questions that you might have. You can reach out to us at parenting@iastate.edu, because we love getting your questions.
So come along as we tackle the ups and downs, the ins and outs, and the research and reality all around the science of parenting.
The Science of Parenting is hosted by Mackenzie Johnson, produced by Mackenzie DeYoung, with research and writing by Barbara Dunn Swanson. Send in questions and comments to parenting@iastate.edu and connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or accommodation inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.